Welcome to the Cyber Fusion Report, the podcast where we cut through the noise and expose the gaps putting our enterprises and infrastructure at risk. I'm your host, Gary Mullen, and today we're tackling a truth most companies don't want to face. Your OT environments, the lifeblood of manufacturing, energy, and logistics, are the weakest link in your cybersecurity strategy. But there is a way forward, and it requires a new model, the Cyber Fusion Center. Let's get started. Welcome to the Cyber Fusion Report, powered by PhishCloud, where we cut through the noise and talk about what really matters in operational technology cybersecurity. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on one of the biggest blind spots in modern defense, phishing readiness. For years, organizations have relied on awareness training and simulated attacks to measure risk. But the reality is stark. Even after all of that investment in time and money, 97% of employees still can't identify a phishing email. So what if we stopped testing people in isolation and started testing the entire system? Your human layer, your defenses, your visibility, and your response. Well, that's exactly what PhishCloud's custom phishing assessment is all about. Exposing your real-world attack surface, simulate how adversaries operate, and show you how prepared your organization actually is before the next breach does. Today, we'll unpack what that means, why traditional phishing tests fall short, and how leaders can finally see their organization the way attackers do. So let's get into it. Today we have Terry McCorkle, CEO and founder of PhishCloud, and Chris Wiley, Director of Operational Technologies at Cyber Fusion and Strategy. So Terry, let's start with you. What does an organization really look like to a hacker's eyes? Why is it critical for a security team to adopt that attacker's perspective when they're assessing phishing readiness?
Good question. So a little of my background, just so people understand where I get this perspective from, is I spent years as a red team member and leader for both the U.S. Air Force as well as large organizations. And phishing was the number one way we got in doing red team assessments. It was so successful, in fact, that after a while they had us stop doing it and they just gave us a network connection. So the phishing aspect of an organization is really understanding where your OSINT is, what that looks like. So what can an attacker learn about your organization just by looking at the perimeter or your social media or your web pages, news articles, things of that nature. So the red team approach mimics an attacker's perspective and the tactics that they use. So, for example, implementing things to test if your MFA can be bypassed while you're actually having this phishing simulation. So some of the current organizations or some of the current products that people use around just doing training is really not enough to just get people to understand, here's what's safe and here's what's not. So we're asking people to be analysts, security analysts, that others study years to be able to do, and years to be able to identify whether a URL is safe or not, for example. So really the red team perspective, though, is understanding the way people work and understanding the way that the mind works and ways that an attacker can manipulate a person into doing what it is that they're asking them to do. So click on a link, for example, which I'm sure we'll talk more about as we go.
Absolutely. And I know that there's, in many of the types of attacks that are happening today, particularly with the advent of AI, it's impossible for an internal IT guy to mimic what an attacker does from the outside, which is one of the reasons why 97% of employees still can't identify a phishing email. So, Chris, why are these simulation-only kinds of programs failing to deliver real resilience in an environment and actually creating a false sense of security?
Well, I would say that for the most part, what we've done is we've confused activity with outcome. Organizations send thousands of simulated fishes with they achieve this 90% click rate improvement, right? So suddenly, everyone's been trained better. But that 97% failure rate is identifying a real phishing story that's happening in the background where, as you said, we have AI that's generating new pieces. Terry went ahead and pointed out that we do OSINT, and that OSINT based understanding of an organization generally leads to the ability to build true understanding and an email that actually looks like it belongs to an executive or your coworker, so that I can go ahead and get you to click on it. And when we talk about most of the security testing that we do, right, when we talk about someone building out one of these training programs, those training programs are, if it's spelled wrong, or hey, look for the obvious, it doesn't look like the real picture from the organization. An attacker isn't going to go ahead and give you obvious misspellings. And these days, even if I'm coming from some other state actor like North Korea or China, I don't have to misspell things. I can literally run it through one of these LLMs, and I'm going to have every single thing on that page spelled correctly, and it's going to look like it came from the organization. If I go ahead and I go to the organization's webpage, I'm going to go ahead and be able to pull down the logo because it's loading directly into, my browser. So I have the actual image. There's no reason for me not to be able to duplicate it. I don't have to be messy. And it turns out that if it's a real phishing attempt, it's not going to be messy. And that means that we've treated this phishing problem as a training problem when it's actually like kind of a detection and response problem. And we could train all of our employees to perfection. That'd be great, right? They can always recognize when someone misspells something or something looks out of place, and then they're still not going to be able to go ahead and get all of the phishing because the phishing's going to start looking real. And that's what we should expect, is that attackers need one click, one credential, one moment of distraction to go ahead and allow someone into a network. And part of the whole phishing assessment program is to go ahead and have us understand where it is that are the bridge between making a phishing attack and getting into the system might be, and how to go ahead and make that a harder target.
Hmm. So we know that modern phishing campaigns have evolved dramatically, from polymorphic URLs to JavaScript redirects, even AI-driven phishing as a service kits that allow even the most unsophisticated hacker to deliver sophisticated phishing emails out there today. So, Terry, what makes these attacks so difficult for traditional defenses and training programs to stop in an enterprise environment?
I think it's important to understand that the tactics that are being used have shifted, and where it used to be an email would be sent and they would include a link or a file. As things got locked down, it's more difficult to send a file. So now they'll redirect somebody to a malicious website or something where they can convince them to download a file and let them go through a different process rather than just sending it through email. But you're seeing that kind of tactic actually expand far beyond just email. They're using Google Ads, they're using GitHub sites, they're using all sorts of different generation sites. If you have a website that is made for content generation, there's attackers looking at how they can leverage that. If you can generate your own web page and host it, they'll use those services. But they also have access to legitimate websites that are will start behaving in malicious ways, things that they've compromised. And while it looks good, you have to have something that's actually checking in real time for those JavaScript based attacks where the man in the middle is for example, a modern phishing kit, some of the AI generated phishing kits that you can get, they'll actually connect to AI, help write a malicious email, help write the actual content, and then help distribute the emails out to get people to click on it. And it behaves just like a CRM would. So a customer, database, for example, where a marketing organization's reaching out to people, they have full marketing stacks built into their systems now. So they know what's going to get filtered, and what's not. And
Mm-hmm.
that allows them to adjust and look at the success rates getting into inboxes and look at key terms that are changing, what's allowed in, what's not allowed in. So from a red team perspective, some of the things to really start looking at is, what are the modern tools allowing attackers to do? Common techniques are actually using a proxy to make it look like a legitimate website. So, for example, an authentication website, the email is going to reference something that looks similar to an authentication website for an organization. And when they land on it, it's going to look like what they're expecting. So when they enter their information, they're entering it in this proxy portal essentially that the attackers are hosting, and it allows the attacker to then become the man in the middle for the authentication attempt, that token that's being passed. And while it's getting more difficult to just gather the plain text passwords, sometimes that is the case. But it's easier to just get in the middle and grab the session tokens and then send the response or the correct request for MFA, which looks like it's coming from the correct place for the employee, even though the attacker's in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll use these types of techniques to be in the middle of these conversations, gather the token. And a lot of times you have to realize that an attacker doesn't necessarily have to get credentials and log into your network to be dangerous. If they get an authentication token for email, they can a lot of times use that to connect to an IMAP service or a POP service or something that's going to let them download that employee's email inbox, which will probably have sensitive information, understand the conversations they've had, and then target people internally or around the organization or even externally. Oftentimes during incident response, we'll see an attacker spend time looking through the employee's inbox, send out a few other phishing emails internally to do some lateral phishing. And then if they're not getting much out of that, they'll just blast out 10,000 emails using that employee's inbox to whoever's next on their list, other organizations. And so doing this, they're able to continue this cycle, but just realize that there's a huge shift right now to targeting people through social media sites, through their direct email, their personal email addresses, not just work. And I think those are the biggest blind spots for organizations today from what the attackers are doing is they can actually target your users in areas you're not even allowed to test.
Yeah, and I'd also add to that that traditional defenses are generally binary. They're block or allow. Those are your options.
Mm-hmm.
And modern attacks are really fluid. They're not worried about block or allow. They're this URL that's safe at 9 o'clock in the morning, by 9:30 it's not safe. It's an it's a and in some cases you talk about that becoming almost a denial of service. Here I can go ahead and make a whole bunch of locations that you used to use, say on the edge of the cloud, marked as malicious, and then you have defenders that are constantly playing whack-a-mole trying to follow those locations.
Mm-hmm.
Or someone passes you an email, and it passes all automated checks. Payload that the email carries is what's malicious, and it sends you to a site that was malicious, right?
Not
So it's
only that,
what it doesn't pass, it's what's on the next side.
well, and they can also time it now. So they're using timing based attacks where they'll change the DNS and where it points to, within the attack. But originally it looks like it's going to Google or it's going to Yahoo or it's going to wherever, and they can change where that's directed to. So by the time it's in the inbox, it's actually going to a different location. So you got to keep in mind that there's, like you're saying, Chris, there's a lot of different ways that attackers are going to continue to evolve these attack chains.
And the poor guy in accounting whose job it is to do numbers every day has no clue what's going on in the background on this stuff, which is why they're at such risk today. So we talk about evaluating both human behavior and technical response, right? Why is, Chris, I'll throw this at you. Why is that dual layer testing important? And what's the difference between testing employees and testing defenses?
Well, testing employees is just asking the question of, did you click? Where I would say that testing defenses is what happens next. Right? So when we talk about, did your email filter catch the bad email? Right? That's the technical side. If not, did your endpoint protection trigger after the bad email was looked at and clicked on? Did the user report that they accidentally clicked on something malicious? That's definitely something that we see a deficiency in. So what happened next? How long from the time that the email was triggered before the SOC went ahead and saw it, before the CFC went ahead and was able to look for the different indicators in the traffic, block the site, go ahead and remediate the device? Could they correlate it with other types of suspicious activities? Did your proxy block the credential harvesting? Did you have a proxy in place in the first place to go ahead and help you block that harvesting? How fastly could you disable the compromised account? So there is this, did you click on it? But then there's also, what did you do next? How did you respond when the real phishing attack occurred? Or in the case of doing a phishing assessment, did you respond appropriately to the phishing assessment? Because they should essentially be the same thing. I present a bad thing, and then you go ahead and respond to it. And it doesn't matter if I'm a tester or if I'm the actual bad guy. We should assume everyone's a bad guy. So real phishing attacks aren't single events. They never are. They're a chain of events. How do I get in, and then how do I move forward from there? So a comprehensive assessment reveals which links in your defensive chain are weak. When we look at it, it's a shift from security awareness to security operations testing. The best assessments don't just generate a click report. I mean, that's great, but they generate actionable intelligence that flows directly into your threat operations. They provide you a real, whether your technical controls, your people, and your processes work as an integrated system, or are they just disconnected islands where, if I have one in place, but then I just go ahead and I scoot around it with my kayak.
So Terry, you mentioned OSINT a little bit ago, and I think we should dive into that a little bit further. So when you're talking about combining open source intelligence with customized phishing, which is what we're doing here as kind of a red team assessment of their capabilities, what kind of new visibility does that give a security leader into their overall exposure, and how does that kind of reshape phishing risk management?
I think it's important to understand how it is that attackers are targeting people using OSINT. So when you're talking about open source intelligence, this is information that's out there about a person. And depending on a person's privacy settings, they can be completely anonymous online or they can share everything online. Well, as an attacker, you're going to look at the people within that organization, find their websites that let you know a little more about them, right? Now, from an organizational perspective, you can do this by looking at current initiatives, press releases. What are the types of things that an organization is putting their presence to? Right? What are the actual investments that the company is making? those actually help to lead you to the people that are in charge of those sort of things. And it allows you to start building a tree of who may report to them within an organization. And from there, you can really look at, what are the types of things that an organization might be susceptible to. So, for example, maybe there's a new regulation standard that's coming out and everybody in the organization is all hands on deck. That's something that may or may not be talked about, but if you know this organization is going through something of that nature, it's fairly simple to find that person within the organization's tree that would likely be responsible for that and use those individuals to send phishing emails on the behalf of the organization.
Mm-hmm.
Now, additional things that you can look at there are, what kinds of logos are available? How is it that a signature happens? A phishing email could be sent to an organization and in more than one way. Maybe my first phishing email is actually just to get somebody to reply with your signature block. And it's no more than that. That I can easily do through an HR program or through some kind of public relations program. It'll give me an idea of what your email template looks like. So those are the sort of things that an attacker does using OSINT. And the reason we see a much higher percentage of click rates in a red team style operation that uses OSINT and targets the corporation from an overall visibility perspective, you just got to realize that's what a sophisticated attacker is going to do. And we like to map that out and explain it and show where those resources are online, show how we put together this picture, and also go into detail around what kind of public breaches have employees been part of. That's the number one way that people make it onto those phishing lists, is to be part of a public breach. So you got to look at all of those pieces together to understand how an attacker is actually going to target the organization. Now, one additional thing that I realized we do as a cybersecurity industry, when we're talking about the vulnerabilities of a computer, for example, we can talk about the port that you would connect to, the service that you would connect to. We talk about a vulnerability and publish a CVE, and it'll tell you which part of the software that's actually targeting. But when we're talking about people, it's much more difficult to do that, right? A person is going to behave based on several things. So the way I like to put this is, if you think about our inputs and outputs as human beings, we can see, we can hear, we can speak as an output, right? But from an email perspective, what are the things they'll actually be targeting? Well, it's a vision. They're going to be doing this through a person's vision, right? So that is your vulnerability as a person. And as an individual, what are those things that can be exploited? Well, they can exploit your emotions, they can exploit your fears, they can try to make something seem like it's a huge issue and they need to take care of this right now for the urgency, which then also kicks in other things that make, people nervous, but that sense of urgency will oftentimes override that. So, in addition to understanding how people actually work and how power of suggestion helps move them along, attackers understand this very well. And they understand sometimes it's not the first email, sometimes it's getting them to respond in any way so that you can then give them breadcrumbs and convince them to do something that wouldn't otherwise make sense. So just keep in mind that we're dealing with people and not cybersecurity vulnerabilities. And people have a different set of vulnerabilities, and we need to realize that's what attackers are targeting, and that's why they're successful.
I would say that
Right.
OSINT turns a phishing assessment from generic into surgical, right? I know what I can see in terms of an attacker when it comes to going and looking online at exposed credentials that are in, that have come out through a data breach, or organizational structure on LinkedIn, technology stacks inside of job postings, personal interests on social media. I can go ahead and I can look and see what the CEO, the CTO, the COO, what they like to do, and how I might be able to engage them as persons rather than just employees of an organization. You can craft attacks that mirror real threat actor tradecraft. And as Terry was, kind of alluding to, it turns out that if we talk about progressive organizations, people who would hire someone for doing a phishing assessment as opposed to, let's do some phishing training, right? Progressive organizations are operationalizing this type of intelligence. They understand what their footprint looks like from a digital perspective, and they're feeding that into a continuous monitoring, right? They're feeding that into what is their exposure footprint, and then taking a look at that from the perspective of their own security operations. And it becomes kind of an ongoing threat intelligence function where it's not just a point in time exercise, but how do you pivot so that you are always looking at how you're exposed from a secure.
So it sounds like this is dramatically different from the standard phishing test, the out of the box simulation services that a lot of organizations sell and people buy, particularly with their training programs. So tell me, Chris, what does an organization learn from this kind of multi-layer adversarial simulation, and why do we advocate for a red team style approach to phishing readiness and phishing risk?
Because attackers don't follow your rules. They don't send phishing emails at predictable times with a warning footer. Oh, by the way, this is a phishing attempt. They pivot, they adapt. Terry was talking about the idea that they have a CRM in their phishing structure. So I know what I got to click out of, and then I know what is getting a higher click rate, and I can adjust using AI emails I want to pivot with. And I've received some clicks back, I've received some responses back. So the standard phishing tests are sterile. They send an email, they measure clicks, they send training. Yay. Red team style assessments are adversarial in nature. They test if your CFC can detect lateral movement after the initial compromise. They evaluate whether your incident response playbooks actually work under pressure. They reveal if your threat intelligence feeds are identifying the infrastructure being used against you. Organizations learn what their true resilience is in a phishing assessment, a red team style phishing assessment. They don't learn that in a training school. I would say that what we see in mature security programs is evolution from we ran a phishing test to we ran a coordinated threat simulation, multiple teams involved, and we are working towards some sort of vendor engagement, right? It's a cross-functional operation where we are building an organization that reacts kind of muscle memory style, where I go ahead and I send out a phishing test. We expect that certain people are going to click on a variety of things. Again, Terry had alluded to sending out HR style engagement emails. I just would like a PR release. And that doesn't sound in any way, shape, or form malicious, and that's what PR teams do. So they respond back, and their email is going to respond back with a structure of a signature block. Now I use that structure of a signature block on my behalf, and we move forward. How can an organization understand how to fully diagnose unless they've had to face that through red team style assessment and adversarial style assessment against their organization, on a almost continuous basis?
Very good. Well, Terry, the last question goes to you. We talk about this red team approach versus what most organizations are doing today, which is simply providing a false sense of security and not providing them the real risk metrics that they need. How do you, beyond just click rates, What are the metrics that actually matter? How do you measure success after one of these readiness assessments? And how do tools similar to our own Fish 360 actually change the outcome from being reactive within an organization to delivering proactive defense?
So one of the biggest things that led to the beginning of PhishCloud was I was recognizing that across the industries, it didn't matter which industry I was in, whether I was assessing a military base or whether I was assessing a power grid or a state organization, whatever it was, that ability to target the individuals, right, and get in through those means was the number one way we got in. And when I was looking at, the background of these attacks and why is it that we can't detect this actual phishing activity, I realized the industry has really pigeonholed it to mainly a email-based phishing
Right.
detection approach, and then they try to train people on that. And it was one day I was looking at a link and I was sitting there trying to figure out, even as a security person, how do I assess this link? And I took it and I put it into the different sites and tested that and realized that an average person isn't going to do that. And the reality is average person is not a security analyst. So what we've done at PhishCloud was take that data from these many different sites that can be used to assess a URO. And we automated that so that we can get that to the user in 1.5 seconds. And that missing data piece was what the industry, it didn't matter whether I was looking at a modern cyber fusion center or a top of the line security operations center, that click level data, context data of when did a person see something, when did they click on it, what was on the site, did it have what looked like a malicious script. Those are the things that led to understanding that we need to be able to give people an understanding of that before they click on that link. And that means you only have a couple of seconds. So that's what we built at PhishCloud. And if it was up to me, I wouldn't do phishing simulations at all. Focus on what's actually happening. We have to train users, but we don't have to train users at the expense of trust of the security organization. Our red team phishing assessments, they follow the methodology that an attacker will use to demonstrate just how successful an attacker can be in your environment. And these are assessments that oftentimes even organizations that have been running training, they've been running these types of campaigns for a while. It differentiates how you realize an attacker may act if you are being actively targeted versus the basic compliance mandates and checklists that most organizations work off of. So the number one goal of PhishCloud and the Fish 360 product is to actually reduce the amount of time people are exposed to this risk. And we can reduce it to about 1.8 seconds and provide the data that shows who's seeing and being targeted in a real-time nature. And that's what I believe the industry really needs in order to evolve into that next step of protecting people, really making them part of the process instead of being alienated as the problem.
Well, 1.8 seconds is definitely better than the average of 7 hours it takes for a security professional to find out that a phishing attempt has been clicked in their environment.
Exactly. And that's reduced over time, but 7 hours, the attacker's come and gone.
Yeah. Have you, in all the red team phishing assessments or readiness assessments that you've done, have you ever not been able to own a client?
I've never had a phishing assessment that was not successful. As a matter of fact, in the military, our number one challenge when we were sending real phishing attempts with malware and full attack chain, it was actually how do we limit the the reach of this phishing attempt, because you can make something very intriguing to people, an Excel spreadsheet with, next year's budget or next year's pay scales or anything like that.
Or Sonic the Hedgehog.
People are going to open it, and then when they can't actually do the compute piece because they have to enable macros, that's how you get them, and they will do it. And so as somebody who was using that over and over again, I'd never seen a situation where it wasn't successful. The more intriguing you make it, the more outrageous you make it, it's clickbait and people will click it. So just realize that as you're looking at your organization and trying to understand where your biggest risks are, yes, it is still with the user making a mistake, but it's not the user's fault. It is something that comes to us by nature, right? Limiting the attacks was always the biggest thing. How do you make sure it stays within a certain network and it doesn't get forwarded off to somebody else? And next thing you know, you have, these exploit shells coming in from other places. So, just and just for a little bit of information on actual assessments we were trying to get in, on average, it took less than 10 emails sent after doing OSINT.
Wow.
So on average, probably 10 emails would really need to be sent in order to gain access to networks.
That should scare somebody, right? So
It's what it is. You can't change
I'm
it.
going to throw an extra question in here that we hadn't talked about prior to this, and you can both respond to this if you like. Most people think of phishing as an IT problem, right? Only happens in the corporate office. But isn't phishing an OT problem as well?
Chris, do you want to take a first stab at that? You've been out you've responded to many, many things.
Yeah, I was actually thinking that there were a couple of breaches that I immediately wanted to speak to, and I went, no, I don't want to toss names. But at the same time, it doesn't matter if it's IT or OT. Realistically speaking, there really isn't a great dividing line between your OT and your IT folks. You end up with poor segmentation because you end up with engineers accessing email from the engineering laptops rather than moving to a separate computer. I'm going to say that I went to an organization where on the actual IT control processes, they had gone ahead and had those IT control processes to allow them to watch soccer games in the control systems because they were getting bored and they weren't allowed to watch them through the proxied services because the IT side of the house was too locked down. And so then because they had the OT side opened up and they were watching soccer games, they were also then checking their email at the same time because they could check their personal email from the same spots that they were checking their corporate email. So phishing campaigns got in. A lot of them in those cases were less targeted at the organization than just, happenstance. Let me see what organizations I can get my hands on. But no, it definitely isn't just an IT problem. If the organization is connected and the connection goes to the outside world, you're going to get phishing attempts and people are going to go ahead and open emails in places they shouldn't. I would even say that if you think about it, someone might get, and this is actually an excellent example of this, is I might get an email sent to me on the IT side that's in a spreadsheet, right? Or maybe it's a patch for a piece of software, and the piece of software is on the OT side. So we move it from the IT side to the OT side, and we bring the malware with us. And that just came through a phishing campaign. So it affects you in so many different vectors that I would say that computers are computers, and that the number one way of getting into a network is always through phishing.
Just to add on that, when I was so back early days of OT attacks, right? You think back to some of the earliest cyber-focused OT attacks, right? And we're talking about things like Stuxnet, talking about things like the Ukraine power grids, organizations where I was working to help understand the attacks and doing presentations around these organizations and how these attacks happen. And I realized that 80 to 90% of all OT incidents had originated from a phishing attack.
Right.
And when you look at how they do this, it's actually a pretty standard recipe, and that is, I'm going to target the engineers in your organization, or I'm going to target the database administrators in your organization with phishing emails so that I can then gain access quickly to those environments. Chris mentioned the workstations. The engineering workstations are the keys into those environments, and that's been proven through many of these different attacks. Is they can come in, maybe not even through your employee, maybe it's through a phishing email that targets one of the contractors who they know works in your environment,
Right.
and next thing you know, there's a USB stick being put into something that was traditionally offline. That is how early attacks happen, and it's how they continue to happen. So that red team style assessment gives you a view on what an attacker might assess, what they might go after, some of those interesting things. But just understand that whether you're protecting an IT environment or an OT environment, they both have networks. They both have people that are on them. And those OT networks that are all connected via an IT network still have influence from the corporate network at some point, at some level, even if it's a hotbox, even if it's segregation, or you've got a VPN that allows access to it separately. Those are things that attackers know about, and they target them.
Yeah,
Yeah,
B2, B2C compromises, business to client compromises
mhm.
are huge. My business account gets compromised, and I'm talking to my third party vendor. My third party vendor isn't as secure when they are VPNing back into my own client space, and they demand that they have to have that online connection into my space in order to go ahead and right size or patch their particular product. And suddenly, because they were compromised, not because my stuff was compromised, but
Right.
because they were compromised, the backdoor comes into my OT environment, and and everything is kind of up in the wind.
Yeah, we talk about third-party risk in the IT world, but in the OT world, it's just as, if not more dangerous, because of the external vendors you have maintaining equipment inside the plant floor, right? Yeah, that's pretty powerful. Well, that's going to wrap up today's episode of the Cyber Fusion Report. A huge thank you to Terry and Chris for sharing their insights on the urgency of a true phishing readiness assessment. If today's discussion left you thinking about your organization, well, that's a good thing, because phishing resilience isn't a checkbox, it's a capability. Legacy awareness programs teach employees what to look for. PhishCloud teaches your entire system how to respond. You can't contain every attack, but with the right visibility, you can stop them before they ever start. To learn more about PhishCloud's custom phishing assessment that can uncover your blind spots and strengthen your defenses, visit PhishCloud.com. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay connected, and always protect the click, defend the core. This has been the Cyber Fusion Report podcast. Thanks for joining us, and for more information, please visit www.phishcloud.com or email us at cfc@phishcloud.com. Thanks, and have a great day.